What's up everybody and welcome to another episode of China Update, where I try and help you guys keep on top of the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. For everyone watching for the first time, I work in China in an executive role, and part of my job requires that I follow the big macro developments coming out of China. I started putting these videos together for my mates back home, and they said you should throw that stuff up on YouTube. So if you are interested in following what is happening in the Middle Kingdom, maybe consider subscribing. For everyone else, I hope you've had a wonderful week. I'm not going to chatter too much at the beginning. Let's just jump into this week's China update. But as always, before we jump in, if you enjoy the video, it is a massive help if you smash that like button, because I'm producing this and uploading it in China with a VPN. The YouTube algorithm does not like it, so it's always a big help. This week is going to be very Hong Kong heavy, looking at the developments that have been coming out of the mainland in Beijing, as well as on the ground at the local level in the special administrative region. So without further ado, let's jump into that now. Well, let's start with the mainland. Over the weekend, the Ministry of Public Security made a statement vowing to, quote, fully direct and support Hong Kong police, undermining assurances that mainland security agencies would have a very limited and soft presence in their role in the Hong Kong Police Department. Then there is the Ministry of State Security, Beijing's agency for counterintelligence and intelligence gathering. The Minister of State Security, Chen Wenqing, also spoke over the weekend regarding the ministry's role within the new national security law with Beijing, saying, quote, national security affairs is the domain of central government, end quote. And the Ministry of State Security will, quote, resolutely carry out its duties strictly in accordance with the power given by the law, end quote. Also over the weekend, the EU made a statement regarding the controversial national security law that was passed by the National People's Congress last week, saying, quote, the EU expresses its grave concern at the steps taken by China on 28 May, which is not in conformity with its international commitments, the Sino-British Joint Declaration of 1984, and the Hong Kong Basic Law. EU relations with China are based on mutual respect and trust. This decision further calls into question China's will to uphold its international commitments. We will raise the issue in our continuing dialogue with China. On Monday, the university presidents of Hong Kong University, Chinese University, Lingnan University, Polytechnic University, and Education University all signed a statement expressing their support for the new national security law. Leaders at the University of Science and Technology, Baptist University, and City University did not sign the statement. It was also on Monday that Hong Kong police officially banned this year's annual Tiananmen Square vigil for the first time in 30 years, citing COVID-19 concerns. Despite the ban, however, on Thursday, a few thousand still traveled to Victoria Park in Hong Kong to mark the 31st anniversary of the crackdown. 4 were arrested and pepper spray was employed at a smaller event that evening in Mong Kok. US President Donald Trump gave a speech last week regarding the US response to the legal change that was very light on details. I was looking for more details throughout this week, but they still have not been released. There should hopefully be some concrete examples of how the US is going to respond in the next week or so, and I will update you guys when that happens. We need to keep our eye on the nature of the policy response. Will there only be trade sanctions, for example, or will there also be sanctions in the financial sector? And how is that going to affect the mainland vis-a-vis Hong Kong? These things are very important because there has already been a lot of talk about a trade war being reignited, or it morphing into a much more dangerous financial war between the world's 2 largest economies. Indeed, a financial war has the scope to be far more devastating than a mere trade dispute. On Wednesday, Ip Kwok Him, my apologies, I do not speak any Cantonese whatsoever, I only speak Mandarin and English obviously, but Ip Kwok Him and other National People's Congress delegates, in a statement to reporters, said that the national security law could be enforced in Hong Kong by the end of this month, which of course is much earlier than what we originally anticipated, being around September. Also in a statement on Wednesday, Hong Kong Special Administrative Region Chief Executive Carrie Lam also said that the law may be implemented this month. On Wednesday, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson responded to Beijing through several op-eds in London and Hong Kong, laying out Britain's position. Among his comments, he said, quote, "If China proceeds, this would be in direct conflict with its obligations under the Joint Declaration, a legally binding treaty registered with the United Nations." He went on to say, "Many people in Hong Kong fear that their way of life, which China pledged to uphold, is under threat. If China proceeds to justify their fears, then Britain could not in good conscience shrug our shoulders and walk away. Indeed, we will honor our obligations and provide an alternative." End quote. Beijing responded to the comments through Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian by saying that Britain has no right whatsoever to make such an offer to Hong Kong residents. Regarding its UK treaty, Zhao Lijian stated that China owed no international obligations, saying, quote, "You cannot find a single word or article in the joint declaration that confers on the UK any Hong Kong related responsibility after the handover." End quote. And it went on to describe that the UK's previous rule in Hong Kong was authoritarian. Another highly controversial move: on Thursday, the Hong Kong's top legislative body, known colloquially as LegCo, passed a bill which criminalizes insulting or misusing the national anthem of the People's Republic of China, with persons who commit an offense facing a potential fine of 50,000 Hong Kong dollars and up to 3 years in prison. Insulting includes not, quote, "showing standard etiquette for the national anthem." This law has already been in force in the mainland since 2017, and in one high-profile case, a live streamer was charged under the law for singing the national anthem poorly. Before we move on to another topic, there is just something else that does touch on Hong Kong, but it happened in the mainland, that I want to touch on here. On Monday, Beijing outlined plans, quote, "personally planned and promoted by General Secretary Xi Jinping," end quote, to turn Hainan Island into a free trade port similar to Hong Kong. The government plan said that the tropical island, sometimes referred to as China's Hawaii, and it is quite nice actually, and cheaper than Hawaii, will benefit from low income tax, freedoms in trade, investment, capital flows, and an easier investment environment. According to the statement, Beijing wants Hainan Island to be a hub of, quote, "strong international influence," end quote, by 2050. China has special economic zones already, like in Shanghai's Pudong, as well as the Shenzhen region, but none of these are as open as Hong Kong. And none of them are anywhere near the size of Hainan. For those of you who don't know, Hainan Island used to be part, I believe, of Guangdong province, but during the reform and opening up, it was made its own independent province. It has historically been relatively poor. Its current income levels are lower than the national averages, but it is a large island off the coast of mainland China. It's just to the east of northern Vietnam, and in terms of size, it's probably about 2 to 3 times the size of Taiwan, and it has, I believe, more flat and arable land there. Population unknown. I didn't Google it. I'm sorry. So Google if you want to know the population. I think it's like 10 million or something. 8 to 10 million, I believe. It has since seen development, but like I said, it is not as it hasn't surpassed the national mean. And it seems that this plan was either a signal that the mainland didn't need Hong Kong, it could make another Hong Kong, or an attempt to hedge its bets, or perhaps it's completely unrelated, which I don't know, could happen. So could something like this go head to head with, say, a Hong Kong or a Singapore? Well, while the proposed policies that were in the plan on Monday do go further in writing than what we see in the Pudong area of Shanghai or Shenzhen, they are nowhere near the level of liberalization that you see in, say, the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region or in Singapore. Next up, I want to talk about a Chinese policy that is particularly important to the central government and Xi Jinping personally. It has been recorded. On Sunday, 九时, the Chinese publication published a 2019 speech by General Secretary Xi Jinping discussing the 2020 goal of doubling the 2010 economy and building a, quote, well-off society, end quote. In the speech, Xi Jinping said China had, quote, basically achieved the goal of building up a comprehensive, well-off society, end quote, causing China watchers to speculate that perhaps the government will declare the goal basically achieved this year despite the COVID downturn. In fact, the following day, on Monday of this week, Yang Weimin, Deputy Director of the Economic Affairs Committee under the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, that's one of the two sessions that happened last week, the CPPCC, said that the target had basically been achieved, to use his words. Now, the reason I bring this up is not to discuss whether claiming victory here is or is not sensible, but rather to look at this type of policy objective and the means of pursuing it and discuss whether it makes sound policy sense. So what exactly is the goal? It is to create a well-off society. It is basically to create wealth and allow more and more regular Chinese people to improve their standard of living, which is a very laudable goal and should be the goal of any government around the world, wherever it is. How is this goal going to be achieved within this 10-year frame? Well, Xi Jinping says in a speech, quote, "The goal of doubling the per capita income of urban and rural residents in 2020 as determined by the 18th National Congress of the Communist Party of China can be achieved on schedule," end quote. So a big part of it, of course, is meeting GDP numbers and doubling per capita GDP. Now, this is, in my mind, a poor metric and a poor objective to have if your overall goal is to improve the standard of living of millions of your own citizens. I'm going to break down why I believe this to be the case. First point, in China, GDP is more of a political number than a useful economic one. It doesn't indicate quality growth that increases the production capacity of the country as a whole. For those of you who are interested in going deeply into why this is the case, I would highly recommend the speeches and the writings of Michael Pettis, who is a top professor at Peking University in Beijing. He actually recently released a book called Trade Wars, Class Wars. He's also all over YouTube. I would highly recommend. I'll put a link of his below for his most recent conversation that he had about a week ago with, I think, Carnegie, India. But he deals with this question in a lot of detail and is really worthwhile listening to how he lays out his views on this particular point, as well as his other views on the trajectory of the Chinese economy and issues in balancing. I might actually do an entire episode that look into some of the top economists in China, liberal economists in China, both foreign and Chinese, and just lay out what their consensus is in terms of the issues within the system and how to achieve a rebalancing going forward and what your potential outcomes could be. But I don't want to go too much down that track now because we're talking here about why per capita GDP is not a good measure of increasing household wealth. Okay, back on track. The second point is that current economic growth, or GDP growth, is built on credit and debt, which is rising faster than the capacity to service it, which means it's not sustainable as a growth model. 3, per capita GDP is even more deceptive when it comes to measuring the relative prosperity of Chinese families, not just due to massive wealth disparities, which does exist in the country, and there's another entire video looking at the level of wealth disparity and the social and political issues it causes in China. But not just because of wealth disparity, but more importantly because China's households' share of national GDP is less than 50%, one of the lowest in the world, and a direct result of Chinese government's full control over the financial system. So even if we were to assume, for argument's sake, that the GDP numbers are both accurate, sustainable, and a good reflection of real quality growth, while per capita GDP in China is approximately 1/5 to 1/6 of the US levels, depending on how you measure, per capita disposable household income, that is the money the households actually get to spend, is approximately 1/9 or 1/10 the levels you see in American households in real terms. What I'm basically saying is having GDP and per capita GDP political targets not only severely undermines healthy resource allocation and wealth creation, but at best fails to achieve or even go in the correct direction in achieving the underlying policy objective, which is to improve the wealth and living standards of the people. And at worst, it is counterproductive to that end. If you guys are interested in this is just the real basics. If you guys are interested in this, I can do a much bigger episode on this particular point. But like I was saying before, check out Michael Pettis. I'll put a few of his links below. He is an excellent mind on some of this, particularly the need to rebalance. He's been talking about it for years and he really knows his stuff, and he's China based. On this point as well, before we move on, the point of household wealth within China. Last week in a work report, Premier Li Keqiang said that China still has approximately 600 million people earning less than $100 a month. Okay, before we go into the last bit about India and China, I do want to quickly touch on a story from the Associated Press that looks at concerns within the WHO regarding China in early January. Now, I was very hesitant to discuss this here because it is a story that has been released through leaks, and it's come from one media agency. And when I discuss these developments on here, I am typically looking at a story, and I have dozens and dozens of different sources from different languages that I look at, and then I come to a conclusion regarding how I want to present it to you guys here. This is one story, but it does seem like there is a lot of support behind it. So I'm going to discuss a few of its lines, a few important lines from the story, and then move on to the next thing we need to talk about. I'm just saying, take it with a grain of salt that this is coming from one publication and it is based on leaked material. So you want to take all of that in mind when we look at its findings. But it is consistent with a lot of the concerns that many have had over the last few months, including concerns that we've discussed on here as early as January. And you guys will remember that I first started talking about the virus in China from about January 10th, a few weeks before it became major mainstream media headlines. So let's just quickly look at this now. Throughout January, the World Health Organization publicly praised China for what it called a speedy response to the new coronavirus. But behind the scenes, it was a much different story. One of the significant delays by China and considerable frustration among WHO officials over not getting the information they needed to fight the spread of the deadly virus. But behind the scenes, it was a much different story. One of significant delays by China and considerable frustration amongst WHO officials over not getting the information they needed to fight the spread of the deadly virus, the Associated Press has found. China, in fact, sat on releasing the genetic map of the virus for more than a week after 3 different government labs had fully decoded the information. Tight controls on information and competition within the Chinese public health system were to blame, according to dozens of interviews and internal documents. WHO officials were lauding China in public because they wanted to coax more information out of the government, the recordings obtained by the Associated Press suggest. Privately, they complained in meetings the week of January 6 that China was not sharing enough data to assess how effectively the virus spread between people or what risk it posed to the rest of the world, costing valuable time. So a few weeks ago, we discussed a very tense standoff on the Sino-Indian border in the LAC, the line of actual control. The LAC border is the result of a Sino-Indian agreement signed in 1993 after years of territorial standoffs which attempted to mark out a long stretch of border between the two countries. Since we last discussed the standoff, the situation has escalated and remains serious into this week. Both sides have released videos, mostly unofficial videos and seemingly for publicity purposes, of soldiers violently beating up members of the other side, which is incredibly concerning when you consider just how easy it is for something like this to escalate. Videos suggest that these Asian giants have hundreds and maybe even thousands of soldiers physically beating each other up and capturing people, while more and more soldiers enter the region as reinforcements. So you can see a very serious escalation happening already. Even though there are not weapons, these soldiers aren't carrying weapons into this area as per the relevant agreements, the fact that there is so much violence and that it's being publicized really reduces the political wiggle room between the countries at the diplomatic level to try and de-escalate the situation. Reports say that the Chinese People's Liberation Army has been gradually ramping up its strategic reserves and its rear bases near the line of actual control, bringing in artillery, infantry, combat vehicles, and heavy military equipment. India has been doing the same. India has said that it will not back down until the pre-crisis status quo has been restored. Some in the Indian media and in government have accused the Chinese side of taking advantage of the pandemic to launch operations in the disputed area. News 18 India, for example, in a story about the timing of the tensions, quoted a senior Indian officer who said, quote, "China stabbed us in the back in the middle of a pandemic. This was not expected," end quote. Beijing denies this, of course, but this is happening at a time where we're seeing very assertive behavior at the territorial peripheries, not to mention what is happening with the national security law in Hong Kong. We've discussed Taiwan and the South China Sea, but there has also been increased activity in the East China Sea around the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands. So this could well be part of a wider policy to push or be more assertive at these territorial peripheries during a time of international crisis. Okay guys, that is our episode for today. Thank you so much for watching. It was great to see you as always. Stay safe wherever you are. Don't forget to smash that like button if you haven't, and I will see you guys next week. See you later.